to today's lunch club. It's the title of the lunch club today is Medical Marijuana Extraction Technology and Product Formulations by Dr. Mark June Wells. He's Chief Science Officer for Organic Remedies. As far as an introduction from Mark, it's certainly a pleasure and an honor to do this. He worked with me in the invasive aquatic plant program from 2010 to 2012. He came out of Rutgers with a PhD in plant ecology. We had a postdoc opening and we sought applicants, and his application came across my desk. And at the time, it was extremely difficult to find aquatic plant ecologists, which we were looking for. And we noticed that Mark was, he had more of a terrestrial background, but I noticed on, I believe, the Rutgers website that there was a picture of him in a canoe with a kayak with a smile on his face. And I said, that's close enough for me. Looks like you know aquatics. And we hired him, and with a little bit of training, he came up to speed extremely quickly and worked out extremely well with our program. We published many things together. We won an award in 2015. The National Aquatic Plant Management Society awarded us with the Outstanding Paper of the Year for some work we did. Again, it was really a great partnership when Mark came on. Since then, he still is involved in aquatic plants. He has a company here in Connecticut called Aquatic Ecosystem Research, and he has staff here in Connecticut that are doing the work here. But he is also now sort of split off into two different things, and he got involved in 2014 with a company called Connecticut Pharmaceutical Solutions, which dealt with cannabis, medical marijuana, and that sort of thing. And then that moved further along for him, and he ended up moving to Hawaii, where he was a science advisor for a company called Aloha Green Apothecary. And since then, he has come back to the States and is now Chief Science Officer for the company called Organic Remedies Incorporated, which is a multi-state vertically integrated cannabis company. So with that, I will turn it over to Mark, and you can take it away and tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Sure. Thank you, Greg. And happy to be talking to the folks at CAES, because I had a great 3-year stint there, and happy to see some names that I recognize in attendance here. So a little more about Organic Remedies. We operate in New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Missouri. As Greg mentioned, we're a vertically integrated cannabis company. We also do formulations with CBD, but we're primarily a medical or adult use cannabis company that focuses primarily on THC. Where I am today is in our main facility here in Pennsylvania. We have a 200,000 square foot grow and a 5,000 square foot laboratory that produces a variety of raw materials that you'll learn about today, and a variety of formulations that you will also get to learn about today. And we churn through, give or take, about 1 metric ton a month input material to this laboratory. And I'm going to be talking about the technologies and products and stuff during this meeting, but at the end of it, we're going to have to stop recording, and I will take you through an actual working cannabis laboratory. And I know there's a lot of scientists in the room, and that may or may not have dealt with large equipment. So there's going to be a lot of stuff that you guys are familiar with, just at a much larger scale. And I thought that might be interesting to all of you to see. So with that being said, I'm going to start to share my screen, and we'll go through the presentation, and then I will, hopefully, time permitting, take us on a tour, and then we'll take questions at the end. All right, so not much to be said beyond with this particular slide because I've already given the introduction of the company. So, why isn't it working? Okay. So this is just the title slide. There's our logo. Feel free to look us up online. You can go through our website and you can see all of the plants that we grow and the different products that we make if you have interest beyond this presentation. So what are we going to cover today? Well, this talk will cover the important constituents of cannabis sativa, the current state of cannabis research in regards to its pharmacology and medicinal uses. I'm going to keep that sort of abridged, and you'll see why at that time. Then we're going to talk about extraction technologies, the different ways that we can produce crude or raw extracts from the marijuana plant. And then we will go through the various manufacturing frameworks that exist. And then I'll show you some examples of cannabinoid products. And then I'm going to briefly go over some studies that I've been running here and also in concert with a college in Philadelphia, Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine, and our, I guess they'd be, I don't know where they fall in terms of the FDA standpoint, but we'll go through the sort of things that we're running there and will be ongoing. And then with time permitting, we will go on a quick laboratory tour of this facility here. So let's start with talking about the important components of cannabis sativa. When people think about this plant, particularly in regards to its history and, you know, the war on drugs, etc., they tend to focus mostly on the cannabinoids. However, there's a whole lot more to this plant. The cannabinoids are only one part of the story. This particular plant creates between 80 and 120 different cannabinoids that have been identified at this point. And obviously the ones that garner the most attention are THC and CBD, as well as there's a variety of medicinal claims associated with those phytocannabinoids as well. Beyond that, the plant also creates terpenes. Most of you in this meeting here probably know that terpenes are one of the largest phytochemical groups on Earth with over 30,000 different identified compounds. And these are the compounds that give plants their smell. The reason that pine smells like pine, the reason oranges smell like oranges are, you know, mixtures of these particular cannabinoids. In regards to pine, we're talking about alpha pinene and beta pinene, as well as a vast suite of others. Terpinolene is another example. In regards to things like oranges, we're talking about limonene, nerolidol, valencine, and the list goes on and on. But those are the phytochemicals that are associated with the smell of cannabis or any number of things that you've encountered throughout your life. There are even a few of them produced by animals, which off the top of my head, I don't remember what they are, but if anybody is interested, I can certainly pull up that reference for you. And these terpenes also are thought to have some nutraceutical or therapeutic functions as well. Beyond the terpenes, we have things like flavonoids, which are polyaromatic compounds that are very important in the nutraceutical framework. And as you'll see, are also important in the medical world as well, particularly some that are associated with cannabis and cannabis only. Then, of course, there's carotenoids. Just rewinding real quick, flavonoids tend to be yellow to brown in color, and that'll be important when we start looking at the extracts that we've produced in this lab. Carotenoids are tetraterpenoids, so they're actually very large terpenes that have a variety of different nutraceutical values to them. They tend to be orange to red in color, and that again will be important when we take the laboratory tour to remember. Then, of course, there are the fatty acids and waxes that are part of the plant. And if we look at the picture that's on the screen here, you can see there's a whole bunch of hair-like structures called trichomes, and those things are essentially, you know, they hold a wide variety of fatty acids there, as well as the outer portion of the plant, and they're generally for protective purposes, but they also have some value in nutraceutical and the pharmaceutical world. So with that being said, we're going to move on to the current state of medical research. So what do we know about the benefits of marijuana? Well, the answer really is nothing. And that's one of the things that interested me about this field initially when I got the opportunity to work in it, is that it's new. Because of the prohibition on this particular plant, not a lot was known. You could not get federal funding for research, and it was a wide open field for, moving either some sort of nutraceutical research forward or potentially even pharmaceutical. But at the end of the day, the answer is, at this point, we don't know, and there's a lot of work to be done. What has that caused? Well, that has resulted in a whole lot of misinformation out there. If you go and just type into Google, what is the value of cannabinoids or terpenes, and you just ignore all of the white papers, the ones written by academics and people like you, well, it'll tell you it's a panacea, cures cancer, cures Parkinson's, cures everything. It appears to be, at least if you listen to places like Weed Maps or Leafly or places like that are on the internet, this plant can do everything. But as a true logical thinker would understand that can't be true, first of all, and that ultimately there's a huge need for research. So as I previously mentioned, the federal status of cannabis sativa in particular, with a focus on delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, commonly known as THC, well, it still can't cross state lines. In general, I don't think that they're offering federal funding for it. And hopefully that will change in the future, where this research can open up and we can really start to understand what the value of this plant is, and we can start to remove some of the hyperbolic talk about it. Okay, so let's first talk about this particular review that was done by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And they reviewed all of the literature that was available at the time of this study, which was about 2017. Well, they broke it out into different sort of evidence classes. The first would be substantial evidence. And after their, I guess it would be, and forgive my lack of knowledge in terms of what this would be called, but I think it's sort of either a beta or a meta study, one of the two. But what they did was they took other people's research, collated it, and drew their own conclusions from it. So what they found was that there is substantial evidence to support that THC and CBD can be used in the treatment of chronic pain in adults. They also classed anti-emetic effects from chemotherapy into that class. And this is a very important first word, patient-reported reductions in multiple sclerosis spasticity. So that's what they consider to have good backing in terms of the research that has been done. Moderate evidence. Improved short-term sleep outcomes, improved sleep. Now, keep in mind that these particular studies are solely focusing on THC and CBD. So there's a lot more work that has to be done, but in terms of this particular study, they did find that there was moderate evidence to support that sleep can be improved in some way, shape, or form from cannabis. Limited evidence. Thwarting HIV wasting disease. Another important word, clinician measured multiple sclerosis spasticity. There's limited evidence for that. Limited evidence for improved anxiety symptoms from PTSD or otherwise, and limited evidence for improved performance after traumatic brain injury. Now, where is there insufficient evidence? Well, cancer treatments. A lot of people will focus on the role of the endocannabinoid system in apoptosis and the agonistic effects of THC and CBD and, promoting that downstream cascade to cause cell death. So appears to be, as far as PNAS is concerned, there is limited evidence in that regard. Also for irritable bowel syndrome, for settling smooth muscles, in epilepsy, and in substance abuse cessation. So what does this tell us? While I would agree that the proceeding of National Academy of Sciences is a conservative group, I think this is the way we have to look at it, is that at the end of the day, there is a lot more that needs to be learned about this plant. Furthermore, it's not just the cannabinoids that interact at the endocannabinoid system. Some of the terpenes do as well. At least the evidence suggests that they do. So therefore, we have what is colloquially referred to as the entourage effect, where we have agonist and antagonist sort of interactions happening at the receptors. And therefore, we have to really look at what we know now as sort of a shotgun approach to therapy. And so far as that you are basically just throwing things at an ailment in a mixture that is, at this point, and in almost all cases currently, not designed. It's would fall more into a nutraceutical approach to treatment of ailments. And therefore, there needs to be a lot more research that needs to be done. And here is an example of why. Because everybody focuses on the cannabinoids. What they tend to forget is that, yes, while you're either smoking, vaping, or consuming orally or otherwise, the cannabinoids in an essential oil framework, which will make sense to you shortly when I go over the manufacturing pipelines, it's not just those things that are present. A lot of these therapies that are out there, at least in their formulated forms, have incorporated things like flavonoids, etc. So there's more to this plant than just the cannabinoids, which gets the most attention because, well, I don't think I need to tell anybody in this room what happens when you consume THC. And while that may have caused the majority of the push in the medicinal sense, in this particular case, I'm still unsure that it was wrong to do so because there's so much more that we need to investigate. And in particular, flavonoids. As I mentioned, they're polyaromatic compounds. There's over 6,000 of them that have been identified. And in particular, this particular one, which is unique to the cannabis plant, was shown to increase immune response in pancreatic tissue, increases cancer cell apoptosis in vitro, and delayed local and metastatic tumor progression in vivo. And they also repeated the studies multiple times with a significance value that you can see there as highly significant. So, as I said, we know essentially nothing, and it is very important to actually conduct research because the hyperbolic discussions of this particular plant give a lot of people false hope, and we can probably improve things significantly on the treatment end. That, however, is not my expertise. I am in the world of manufacturing, where I use all of the skills I gained as an ecologist, mainly statistics, to create balanced systems for manufacturing. So let's dive right into it. The extraction technologies. So as you'll see, there are multiple phases to any manufacturing pipeline, and that is also true of cannabis. The first stage is extraction, where we take the raw plant material and utilize some sort of solvent to undertake the extraction. There's also ways to create these sort of extracts without solvents. I'm not going to go over those today. Their yields are really low from a fiscal standpoint. They're not the primary source of revenue for any cannabis business. So therefore, we're going to focus on the solvent technologies where you can actually achieve 95 to 98% efficiency. So that's where we're going to focus today. If anybody has questions about, the physical extraction techniques, I can handle those at the end. So 3 main types of technology: On the left with the blue background is what is called an ethanol extractor. That's a centrifugal ethanol extractor. In the middle is a supercritical fluid extractor. The most common solvent used in that framework is carbon dioxide, although there are other options, but carbon dioxide is for many reasons the one chosen. And then on the right there is what would be called a hydrocarbon extractor. The most common solvents for those particular extractors is butane. There can also be a mixture of butane and propane. And what you'll see in our lab is we actually use pentane. So what do we have to think about when we're talking about any sort of design in regards to extraction? It's always FDA solvent guidance and OSHA safety guidance. Those two things are the most important. So the multiple solvents I just mentioned, ethanol, CO2, and butane, propane, and pentane, all fall into, well, let's remove carbon dioxide from this for a second. That's a gas. It's a different consideration altogether. But in terms of ethanol and the hydrocarbons, they fall into class 3A safety in terms of human consumption, which means that in the FDA guidance, CFR 21 for CGMP manufacturing, are allowed to be present in residual at the end of the process at 5,000 parts per million or 0.5%. Carbon dioxide, you obviously don't have that consideration. It's a gas. So the minute you depressurize it, the CO2 goes into the atmosphere and it's gone. From an OSHA standpoint, this is actually generally the bigger one, is you have different classes of solvents and that are appropriated based on their flammability, as well as other safety considerations such as suffocation. In terms of ethanol, butane and propane, they fall into class 4, which is considered explosive, and therefore you have specific design considerations, what's called a C1D1 build out or explosion proof. When you're dealing with ethanol and pentane, you fall into what's called a C1D2 build out or flame proof. In terms of carbon dioxide, it's actually much easier because you only have to deal with the atmosphere as it applies to CO2 and not flammability. So you have to remain below 5,000 ppm in the air at any given time. So those are the kind of decisions that drive extraction technology decisions. So with that being said, let's look into some of the manufacturing. First thing to note, and I say this to every single employee that I have. I currently have a staff of about 11 here in Pennsylvania, and throughout the United States, my staff is larger than that. I don't even have a count, to be honest with you. But I tell this to every single one of my employees as they come in. I don't care if we're building buttons, we have to manufacture in a consistent, efficacious, and efficient manner to meet the demand of the market, which means that I teach them to focus on things like batching, quality output parameters. I design my systems following a manufacturing idea called the theory of constraints. And I also teach my people about efficiency and what's called quality by design, and teach them things like design of experiments, etc. Generally, I'm running the studies, but I do bring my most astute people into those studies and show them exactly what I'm doing. So with that being said, let's look at these manufacturing pipelines. So let's start with carbon dioxide. And the reason I'm going to lay these out for you is because they're different. They differ in terms of the order of operations and the way you have to balance the system. We're not going to talk too much about balancing systems here. If anybody has any questions about that, I'd be happy to take them. But let's go over the manufacturing pipeline here. And these are some very important terms that I will define one by one here. And then you'll see how they overlay into the other manufacturing lines. So plant material and extraction, that's pretty straightforward. So plant material is accepted. In regards to carbon dioxide, we have to grind it. The reason why we have to grind it is because carbon dioxide is not as good of a solvent as things like ethanol and hydrocarbon. So we need to increase the surface area to volume ratio to ensure that we can get 95 to 98% extraction efficiency in an expeditious manner. Following that, we dissolve that extracted material into ethanol at room temperature, and then decrease that temperature to -40°C, which for anyone in the room knows that's also -40 Fahrenheit, just for trivia, in case you don't know. And what happens at that time is, I'm going to back up for 1 sec before I finish that statement. Carbon dioxide, unlike the other extraction technologies, extracts a large amount of fatty acids and waxes from the plant, just due to the nature of the way the extraction works. What that means is that while that is a valuable commodity and formulation component, we all know that humans eat with their eyes first. It's not exactly pretty when it first comes out. So therefore we have to remove the things that would diminish our observational palatability, if you will, to the consumer. So how we do that is, again, take the extraction, dissolve it into absolute ethanol, drop the temperature to -40°C, the fatty acids and waxes fall out, which allows us to filter them off. That process is called winterization and filtration. Now, what that process doesn't remove is something that makes the extract look dark, almost black, and that is chlorophyll. Oxidized chlorophyll gives a black color to the extract. So in the case of carbon dioxide, we remove that and we use, well, we'll go into clarification mechanisms later. After we remove the chlorophyll, we go through a filtration process that skims down to 0.1 micron, which allows us to remove any yeasts, any bacteria, and things of that nature from the extract. In some cases, it will also remove some viruses, but many viruses are smaller than that. However, I will say this at this time, you find me a human risk bacterium that can survive 4,000 PSI, depressurization from 4,000 PSI in a sequential manner, then survives temperature swings of 40 to -40, and can survive an absolute ethanol, and I'll sell you a bridge in London. Happy to do it. Send me a check. So we just do that as a check to make sure that we are not sending out products that are contaminated with any number of pathogens. What we're left with after that is a large amount of ethanol that is suspending the cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids, carotenoids, and some of the lightest fatty acids that remain. So we have to recover that solvent. And this is our first raw material that we can use in formulation. Now, before I go on to the next step, keep in mind that the plant does not actually produce THC. It actually does not produce CBD either. The plant produces THCA, or tetrahydrocannabinolic acid, and also CBDA. So those have some, there is a thought out there that those are actually valuable in some ways. However, the research needs to be furthered to really understand that. So in this particular case, we would then create a situation where we transform those acid forms to their neutral form in a process called decarboxylation. And that's our second raw material. Now, at this point, we're probably at about, in my framework here, we're at about 70 to 75% pure of the primary cannabinoid. So the next step after decarboxylation, if we wanted to create a more highly pure mixture of cannabinoids, we would do cannabinoid distillation. And there's many ways to do that we'll go over. That'll bring us to about 95 to 99% pure cannabinoids in the mixture. And if we need to isolate any of them individually, we can then use chromatography, which comes in multiple forms. So we're going to move on to the next framework. Now, we went over a lot of these particular steps in the last one. So I'm not going to say much about them here, but you can see that there isn't a winterization step to ethanol. Now, why is that? The reason is because carbon dioxide extraction occurs at elevated temperatures, and therefore the waxes are extracted. Ethanol extraction occurs generally between -20 and -40 C. So therefore we don't have a lot of waxes that are extracted, and therefore you can skip the winterization step. However, there is a lot of plant material in it, so you can't get rid of the filtration step. Clarification is the same, sterilization is the same, so on and so forth. So what about our hydrocarbon pipeline? Again, you'll notice that there's a winterization step, but it's later in the process. The reason is because to winterize in hydrocarbons, you need to be at -80 to -100. And well, that's just a lot of danger to people in terms of frostbite. Now, when you're dealing with small amounts of stuff at that temperature, no big deal. But we're dealing with, 50 to 100 liters of stuff at that temperature. So we have to do things a bit differently. So you can see how it changes. We have an early solvent recovery step and then a late solvent recovery step. The first solvent recovery step removes the hydrocarbon extract or a hydrocarbon solvent. We then dissolve it in 200 proof ethanol and winterize at -40. And then we have another solvent recovery step followed by decarboxylation, distillation, and chromatography. Okay, so let's go into some of the technology here. I'm going to take my phone out so I know what time we're at here. Okay. All right, so carbon dioxide solvent extraction. Well, first thing I'm going to show you, because I talked about the supercritical state, is what the supercritical state looks like. So if you see down here, I'm going to start this video, and you'll see that there's a temperature behind it. To be in the supercritical state, you need to be above 73 bar and above 31 C. Now, this particular watch glass here is already above 73 bar, but now they're going to start increase. Oop, that didn't work. Okay, there we go. So if you watch as the temperature rises, you can see that there's a defined line between the liquid and gas state. And as we hit 31 C, it's going to become turbid, and there'll be no distinction between the liquid and gaseous states. And that is what supercritical carbon dioxide looks like. Now, why carbon dioxide? Well, it's flexibility. You have multiple solutions to get to a certain density, and you can change that density with temperature and pressure parameters to drop off fractions of the extract that you would like to deposit in certain places. Okay, so ethanol extraction. Well, this is an extraction that occurs at very low temperature, and the major consideration here is solvent retention. This can be one of the most expensive ways to go about extraction because of the cost of ethanol. It's not a very flexible system. You basically have one output, and as I mentioned, your ethanol demand is high and therefore can be very expensive. Hydrocarbon solvents. Well, we talked a little bit about the mixtures and types. As I said, this is a cold process, but it does require that the temperature be low, and it still does require a winterization step. Material preparation. In terms of this particular solvent, you do not need to grind the material because it is a very good solvent for nonpolar compounds. Well, up on top is propane, butane, and pentane, and those are all very good solvents for any of the cannabinoids and terpenes. Okay, so let's talk about filtration systems. Filtration systems come in many shapes and sizes, and basically you can break them out into three different stages. One would be your bulk removal, which would be the thing on the blue skid, which is called a filter press. Then the second stage would be polishing, and that's the tubular structure on the far right of the slide that says 3M on it. And then there would be the sterilizing filtration, which are the two different capsules that are there. What's the major difference? Pore size. Your filter press, your rough removal, if you will, or bulk removal is at about 40 micron. Your polishing removal is at 20 micron. And then your final stage or sterilizing is at 0.1 micron. Okay, clarification. How do we remove pigments from the extract? Primarily chlorophyll, because that's the one that actually causes the most optical problems. Well, polarity is the biggest thing. In hydrocarbons, where it's a non-polar situation, you need to use things like magnesium silicate, amorphous silica, or diatomaceous earth. In ethanol, which is polar, you have the ability to use things like activated carbon. Solvent recovery systems. These are the systems that you use to remove your solvent from them. Now, most commonly in the industry, you'll see things like rotary evaporators at the commercial scale. That's what you're going to see here. But as you increase in scale, you'll see the rotary evaporators on the left. The other two in the middle, that's called a wiped film solvent recovery system. And then the one on the far right is called a falling film. Those are the types of systems that you deploy when you have to recover, 60 to 100 liters per hour. So they're very, very fast. Okay, decarboxylation systems. Again, this is scale dependent. I talked a little bit about the cannabinoids that the plant produces, and this is the conversion from the acid form to the neutral form. In general, it requires heat above 105 degrees C, as well as a little bit of water to break off a carboxylic acid group from the cannabinoids. Now, in general, if depending on what your next step is, you may have to pH balance this step, or you're going to get a process called isomerization. And though the common isomers that people hear about now are delta 8 THC, which is trying to skirt the federal regulations in regards to delta 9. However, I mean, if they read the regulations closely, it says all isomers of THC. So neither here nor there. They haven't been arrested yet, so they're probably all right. Factors affecting reaction speed in general are heat and agitation. So in this lab, we do it under vacuum at 165 C, and we can decarboxylate a kilogram in about an hour. And the reason we pull it under vacuum and apply more heat than the 105 is, first of all, for speed, but we pull it to vacuum to remove oxygen, because oxygen will oxidize the cannabinoids, and what you'll end up with is a variety of unidentified cannabinoids and CBN in particular. Distillation systems, again, scale dependent. And I don't have to tell anybody that heat required for boiling anything is dependent on what the atmospheric levels are. And, the scale will dictate whether you need what's on the bottom, which is just a basic glassware, or what's on top, which is a wiped film distillation system. Chromatography systems come in many shapes and forms as well. On the left is a flash chromatography system, C18 column, isopropyl and water, or ethanol water, or any other mixture to separate the cannabinoids. The one that looks like a giant wheel right next to it is what's called a centrifugal partition chromatography system. The one next to that is an industrial HPLC system. And the one next to that is a SFC, or convergence chromatography system. All chromatography requires a ton of solvent and has a significant impact on the scaling of your manufacturing lines. And some of them are, like, for example, flash chromatography and industrial HPLC can isolate the individual cannabinoids, all of them at once, where things like convergence chromatography, you're better off stripping one at a time. And if there's any questions about that, I could take that at the end. Next in line would be emulsification, and we'll talk a little bit about this. So one of the big things in the cannabis world now is everybody uses the buzzword nanoemulsion. I'm not even sure they know what it means. An emulsion, first of all, is a situation where you encourage or create a situation where oil phase and water phase become miscible together. to do that, you have to construct what's called a micelle. A micelle is a mixture of a surfactant of some sort. They come in many shapes and forms, and some sort of oil soluble product. For example, the cannabinoids. And what you do is you have to build the shell around a droplet of whatever your active ingredient is. In this case, mostly THC, but sometimes CBD and the other cannabinoids as well. Now, the definition of a nanoemulsion. Anything above 100 nanometers in size is called a microemulsion. To get anything below 100 nanometers in size is a nanoemulsion. Now, the pharmaceutical functions of emulsions are primarily for bioavailability, because as we all in this room know, our body is 70+% water, and our gastrointestinal tract, well, there's a lot of water in there. So oil will tend to go through that system just as one slug and not be fully dispersed until the small intestine. However, if you create a situation where you can make an oil soluble product water soluble, well, now your bioavailability goes up because it's fully dispersed throughout your digestive tract through the entirety of it. So there's many types of emulsification systems. In general, it's a multi-stage process. The one with the hand in it is called a shear homogenizer. We actually have that same one here. That thing stirs at about 24,000 RPM to create what would be called a crude emulsion. The system above and the system to the right of that are two different ways to get down below 100 nanometers. The one on top is called a sonic homogenizer, and it utilizes high intensity sound waves to break the micelles down further and further and further. The one to the right of the shear homogenizer is what's called a microfluidizer, and it basically pumps in your crude emulsion at high pressure. We're talking, we're talking 800 to 1,000 bar, and it slams that emulsion against baffle plates to break the micelles further and further down. Okay, formulation equipment. Well, there's many different types of that. Depends on what you're doing. You have everything from floristers to depositors to V blenders and pill presses. So it's all dependent on product. Hopefully we can just get to the tour. So let's talk about the different types of products here. On the top left is one of the most common ones. That's a vaporizing cart. Basically your essential oils and distillates, when mixed with your terpenes, will create that sort of product. In the middle is what's called, the middle top is what's called RSO, Rick Simpson's oil. It's just an homage to the man. He used the nasty things bought at Home Depot to create this oil. We use CO2 and ethanol for safety purposes. That is an oral administration. Then we have things like we could put it into lotions. Then we have tinctures or nanoemulsions down at the bottom, what we call elixirs. And then we can powderize it and put it into capsules or press them into pills in their nanoemulsion form. And then, of course, there's the neat concentrates that come out that are highly potent in the acid form of cannabinoids and are vaporized generally. Okay. Analytical equipment, I'm just going to blow by real quick. I have an analytical lab here that I run. We pretty much only have an HPLC at the moment, but let's talk about the types of equipment. On the left is a GCMS, gas chromatography mass spectrometry, and that's utilized for testing residual solvents as well as terpenes. Next to that, to the right, is what's called an HPLC, high performance liquid chromatograph. That's used for quantifying the cannabinoids in the extracts or flour, etc. Next to that is a ICP, which is used for metals testing. And next to that is what's called a LCMS, liquid chromatograph mass spectrometry, which is used for quantifying things like pesticides, mycotoxins, etc. Now, all of these pieces of equipment can all do each other's work. It's just how efficiently you can do it, except for maybe ICP. That one probably can't do the work of the others, but the other three you certainly can do the same work with, just how you do it. Okay, so let's talk about some of the nuances. This is a study that I just completed for the state of Pennsylvania. And what we looked at was whether our extraction process can sterilize material. We started with contaminated material that was hot in total yeast and molds, total aerobic bacteria, and total Enterobacteriaceae. And what we found, I set this up to be statistically ethical with repeated measures analysis and all that. And well, after the first stage, there's no variance. So as you can see, the plant material comes in hot immediately after extraction with hydrocarbons. That's what you're looking at here. It is sterilized. Now, what about CO2? Same thing. So the purpose of doing this study was to convey to the state that a well-designed extraction process can indeed accept contaminated material and thereby sterilize it. Additionally, it's not here, but I also tested mycotoxins during this whole process. First of all, there's no known mycotoxins produced in cannabis currently. They probably exist. They haven't been identified or found yet. But we were at 0 ppb throughout that entire stage. Okay, so as I mentioned, we work with Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. We're currently looking at two things, THC and CBD in the treatment of pain, in particular in nanomicelles. And then we're looking at the bioavailability of cannabinoids in nanomicelles versus normal administration routes. Okay, let's see how much time we got left. We have time for a tour. Ooh, it's gonna be fast. What do you guys think? Or I would go right to questions.
Yeah, Mark, I think we can do a quick tour.
Okay.
We can go a little later. I don't think there'd be a problem if we had questions that went past 1 o'clock.